change behaviors and strategically create a network effect around positive behavior change. How do you begin to architect certain networks that are targeting the type of formation that you need to make a habit something that's contagious?
Yeah, so there is a lot of science that's happening by many groups right now, and a lot of firms that are doing this. Actually, one firm called Activate Networks has licensed some technology from my lab and other labs and is actively trying to do this. I would describe it in two ways. If you're trying to intervene in networks, you can manipulate connection and you can manipulate contagion. So one thing you could do is you could try to seize control of the structure of the network, namely who's connected to whom. And Alcoholics Anonymous is this, and Weight Watchers is this, and all kinds of ways in which we affirmatively rewire networks in order to foster changes that we care about. The military does this. They put people in groups with particular structures, and that elicits from the group, for instance, a willingness to die for each other, which didn't exist before. Before you put all the guys together in a squad, they weren't interested in dying for each other. Now you organize them in a certain way, suddenly they're willing to die for each other, okay? So there are ways in which you can rewire networks, and the experiment that I showed you today is an experiment in which there's active rewiring, and because of that rewiring, you get cooperation to be sustained. Totally different from that is a set of ideas which say, well, we can't force people to be friends with each other. We can't really take Tim and say, okay, you've got to, be friends with Kendra or whatever.
Right.
You guys have to get connected. It may happen organically, but it's very hard to with some kind of force people. So instead you say, okay, we're going to accept the network structure as it is. Instead, we're going to shrewdly target the network with interventions. We're going to identify who, let's say, the influential people are, or where are the cliques of people within the system, where if we target these cliques, we can get a real big bang for a payoff. So we have a little network, we find 6 people within the system that if we pick those 6, not only are they more likely to adopt, but they'll get the whole village to adopt the bed nets or the maternal and child health intervention. And we're doing a lot of research in that area in my lab right now, where we are working in Uganda and in Honduras and hope to work in India, where we map the networks of whole villages and then we try to shrewdly target the health interventions so that we get behavioral transformation for the whole village. There, you accept the network structure as it is, and then you just do the targeting. If I could summarize this nascent literature, I would say that the contagion interventions, on balance, have been more successful than the connection interventions.
You think contagion is the targeting of the people?
For instance, the targeting. Yeah, and it would be like, for example, if you have water that's moving inefficiently through the city of New York, and you have pumping stations and water pipes, and you've got 2 different things you could do. You could build more connections between the pumping stations, or you can flip the valves and manipulate the valves to optimize the flow. The latter tends to work, turns out, more easily than the former.
It's also summarized by the line, ride the horse in the direction it's going.
Yes.
Where it's going.
Yes. It's a very smart idea. I would say that, so both are possible, but I would say that if I had to put my money on what's going to be more successful, now that's not always the case. So for example, there are online companies where if you can get people to come together because they share something jointly at stake. For example, anonymous individuals, both of whom want to quit smoking, or diabetics, both of whom want to manage their diabetes better. And you can create platforms which introduce them to each other and facilitate the interaction so they reinforce each other. Even though they're strangers to each other, because something is at stake, because we're united in our desire to quit smoking, there's evidence that suggests that that's very powerful. And that's a rewiring intervention, right? So you use the internet to connect people jointly around something that they care about. And that's why things like Match.com or massively multiplayer games where strangers participate to go kill the big
Those
people.
2 things actually fit together. When I think about how I've launched new conferences, let's say when I launched the Pearl Conference or the Open Source Convention or even the Web 2.0 events or Strata, any of our events, we go identify key nodes and we bring them together as a way of forming a new network. So it's not just for transmission, and actually you can use that as a way of creating a new structure. We, for example, launched a conference called Velocity, where we invited in all of the big guys in web performance optimization and web operations, because all the important people are there. Everybody else comes, and then it's a new community. And then once you have that community, the new network is formed, and you can do other things with it. So I don't think they're exclusive either.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that Well, very interestingly, Tim, there hasn't been much formal study that I know of that specific strategy, that combinatorial, that combination strategy, where you say, okay, we're going to identify
Key nodes in a network.
and then rewire it at the same time as we target it. Like, I haven't seen that done, actually.
Well, it's sort of like, because there's a latent network that hasn't been recognized. By recognizing, kind of going back to when I put the original open source summit together, it was like, hey, these guys, they all have something in common. They don't know it yet. We're going to make it visible. Once we make it visible, all the other people who are affiliated, go, okay, I want to be part of that network now, and it creates, visibility of the network as a strategy for reinforcing and network forming.
But what's interesting about that, though, is it relies on a very sophisticated level of intellectual arbitrage, which is what you did, right?
Yeah.
So it's not. It also requires a kind of very local knowledge about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're talking about network analysis to identify the key nodes, and if you can identify what ties those nodes together, you can actually form a new network that selects for the qualities that tie together that.
I agree. All I'm saying is that to scale that would
sure.
require cloning you, let's say, right? So you need or having people who have very specialized knowledge of who the actors are, which connections would be valuable, what et cetera, and that, like, if you're trying to do public health intervention in villages, one would need a more systematic set of ideas that you could just replicate without detailed knowledge.
Well, I think this gets back to the fitness function on the third world stuff, positive deviance of looking at population, seeing who's doing something better than the others. But I don't think it's that scarce of a thing. Tim does this in open source. Jerry Mikulski does this he's got a company called Associate that he pulls together people this way. But I think that there's a certain personality that is a kind of a connector. But the problem is, if you were a real estate agent, you can get a commission on each sale. If you're a social network connector and you close the triangle between A and B, you don't get a commission. And if B goes off and form a neat company, you have no. It's hard to make a value out.
In evolutionary terms, there are ways in which you can enhance your fitness by. One strategy is to knit the network around you together, and another strategy is not to do that. And depending on what's happening, I didn't go into this today, but there are ways in which both can be adaptive and helpful. And in fact, there are ways in which groups need both kinds of people. Both kinds of people who don't, basically to kill the mastodon, you need people who can find it and people who can work together to kill it. So you want a group that's composed of individuals that have you want a group that has intermediate level transitivity.
Yeah.
So if Facebook did what you did with your conferences, like if they made a concerted effort to say we were going to identify individuals and then rewire the network, they could have a major impact on a health epidemic.
Well, I mean, that was actually kind of at least part of the premise of Facebook causes, which was that, we're going to find people who are willing to donate to causes, and then we're going to actually, I don't think it's necessarily worked as well as they hope, but then we'll say, oh, they're concerned individuals. We can now point them to other kinds of initiatives. We've identified some characteristics that they have in common, and we're now going to try to, I think the original plan was, at least as Sean Parker explained it to me, was then we're going to try to apply it to local politics, which was sort of interesting.
So you talked about sort of working on the connection, trying to rewire the network, and then you talked about trying to intervene at the targeted points in the network. Can you also tune the contagiousness? So in other words, if you think about the thing you're trying to spread, some viruses spread really well in an airborne way.
Oh yeah, this is such an important idea you just articulated. So I think that is one of the. So that's, I think, one of the scientific frontiers. And so can I have 1 minute to tell you the story? Okay. So here's the way I think about that. So remember we talked about the example of like a disease spreading in a population. We said that whether it spreads can depend on the structure of the network, like the TB example with the sailors. So no one is connected here and everyone is connected here, you're going to get more spread here. So the first thing that matters is the structure of the network. First point. Second thing that matters is who's in the network. So for example, you can imagine a fully interconnected group of people over here, all of whom are immunocompromised. Their immune systems don't work. These guys' immune systems work. Now, in addition to knowledge of the structure of the network, we also need knowledge of the constituent individuals at the human capital level, not at just the social capital level. And now we can see that actually the epidemic will spread much more rapidly in a group of people who are immunocompromised. And finally, it's not just characteristics of the network, it's not just characteristics of the people, but it's also characteristics of the thing that is spreading that is relevant. Now, when it comes to infectious disease, we have a lot of knowledge about this. So for instance, if I seed this network with syphilis, it spreads very rapidly. Because if you have sex with someone who has syphilis, you've got about a 1 in 3 chance of getting it. If I seed it with HIV, it doesn't spread as rapidly, because if you have sex with someone with HIV, you've got about a 1 in 500 chance of getting it per sexual encounter. And that's not to do with the network, nor to do with the people, it's to do with the pathogen. To my knowledge, we have no good understanding at all about which ideas, how to taxonomize phenomena that are spreading, such as ideas, that increases their virality. That is to say, I can't go look at a set of movies, for instance, and say, this movie is more like syphilis, and this movie is more like HIV. There's no after the fact I can tell you, oh, that one did really great. But before, and so the scientific frontier right now is to begin to think about, okay, can we go and look at certain behaviors or certain other phenomena, products, for example, and can we somehow ex ante array them into a space which says, like we can put germs under the microscope, we can see the surface proteins that are more hydrophilic or hydrophobic, et cetera, et cetera. We can't do that with things that spread.
I guess what I was wondering about, so Rogers' diffusion of
Yeah.
innovations has some of the characteristics, like trialability and visibility of the innovation. So in other words, if it says sent from my iPhone, you're seeing that somebody's using an iPhone, and then that makes you think more about it. So it's, there's some things in that which are depends on the kind of thing.
Yeah, I think if they're low cost to acquisition, we would theorize, I suppose, that it would spread more easily. On the other hand, there may be more things that are cheap, that are, you might be inundated by cheap things, and so ignore the cheap ones. I would be hard pressed to call that. I honestly don't know the answer. But there are a bunch of labs around the country that are looking at this topic. I think we will know the answer in the next few years.
Well, I've got a question back to your last chart where you showed the fixed network versus the adaptable network or the flexible one. Is that a kind of a form of therapy of a group that's formed a network that's not working as you want to see it, to actually just break the ties and disrupt it and let it resettle into a new configuration? So kind of excising the...
Yeah, I think that there may be ways in which you can exploit. You could imagine a network therapy, like say this is a dysfunctional network. We can diagnose it as dysfunctional because it has certain features. I'm imagining, I don't know how this. I don't think this is yet doable. And then intervene in some way. My prediction would be that the fundamental structure of the network would probably be the same afterwards, but the particular humans connected would have changed.
So the network wouldn't... The network wouldn't change. Just different players in the same functional roles.
Right. That's just a basic prediction. I'm not sure.
It sounds almost fatalistic. You plant the seed and any network
people
will...
ask me, people say to me, what can I do to make my network better? And there's some play of volition. That is to say, you have some control over where you are in the network. But I don't think you can take a shy person and make them gregarious, for example. I think that there's certain... And it also depends on whether we're talking about purposeful kind of corporate networks, like workplace networks, or our basic kind of friendship networks. For example, I don't think Facebook has made us more friendly, intrinsically more friendly, any more than I think that the telephone converted us from a monogamous to a polygamous species.
Yeah.
Just because now we have a technology that allows me to be in contact with many women at the same time. It used to be really hard to maintain contact with many women. Now, just because I have this technology doesn't make me acquire many wives. I'm still monogamous, right? So I don't think Facebook, just because it gives us the facility to interact with many people and have many friends, converts us from a species that, let's say, had on average 4 or 5 friends to a species that has 100 friends.
But from a practical point of view, you can, in fact, find your way into networks, and in fact, even to a position of centrality. I remember, early in my career, going to a Usenix conference and feeling on the outside of the, that Unix crowd, and within some number of years, I was in the middle of that crowd. And part of it was by being useful to them and by becoming a convener, and so there's a bunch of pragmatic, experiential things that people do know about how to, get into the middle of networks, how to work networks, and some people know them and other people don't. And again and again, I've kind of gone into a new area, and all of a sudden, 3 years ago, Tim O'Reilly meant nothing to people in government. you know, and then I launched my government conference, and now I'm, you know, very well known around the world in open government, and you know, so it's sort of like and a lot of it for me is about the power of the convener to actually, in some ways, you know, it creates a new network, but it also it gets its status from, you know, the people in the network. You know, so my, you know, game plan over and over again is you go find the interesting people, you bring them together. And this is what Jim Barksdale once said to me. He said, "Find a parade and then get in front of it."
Yes.
And you
Just
know,
a second, a horse as well. Drive the horse.
and so for me, a lot of it's actually finding a latent parade that people aren't recognizing, drawing the frame around it, and saying, actually, have you looked at this slice of the network and seen that it's really important and interesting? And then you know, so it's amplifying the value of the whole network in such a way that it recognizes itself more fully, and then, you know, the new people in it, or everybody in it, gains status from the status of the most high status people in that network.
I agree. I mean, I don't want to, you know, I'm coming from a certain point of view, which is treating networks as like the way someone might treat a pancreas, for example, you know, like just as an objective, sort of immutable reality about the world. So I've tried to give the proper caveats for things like, you know, workplace interactions, for example. You know, and I also want to be careful to acknowledge the importance of culture as well, because, you know, even though we might have a certain, for example, biological propensity to make networks of certain types, it's very different being a woman in Saudi Arabia and being a woman in the United States. You know, there's totally different cultural rules about who you can interact with, and those play a role, for example.
Right.
So, so picking up on what you just said, I think there is a way in which people can affirmatively make a difference for themselves and for the groups around them, and they can manipulate where they are in the network, you know, or can move, as you said, to the center. But that's a kind of phenomena that's a little different than the kind that I'm, you know, most knowledgeable.
But no, that's fair. I do think it's worthwhile, though, studying or thinking about, you know, the kind of migration from people, you know, like say in you know, social networks, you'll see people who've gone from inconsequential to becoming very well known, and what did they do, you know? And I think about someone like Alex Howard, who I mentioned earlier, you know, Digifile on Twitter. He was a guy who was originally, you know, he's a reporter for you know, some tech, you know, newspaper in Washington. I hired him. He became our key guy associated with this movement, you know, and bit by bit, he's now incredibly influential in that space. And I don't know what the dynamics are, but it's pretty clear that, you know, we've done it again and again, so it's repeatable, you know, making somebody into a you know, a targeted, you know, sort of center of a network, a key node. And it'd be really interesting to figure out exactly, well, where, I'd love to know where else that happens.
Yes.
I was active with Network Solutions. Our company bought them and for $10 million and sold it for $3 billion. And this was before the namespace really took off. But it was an avalanche effect. That's a whole other theory here. But I call it being a ticket taker at the avalanche. So you find something that's avalanching and figure out how to charge for it. So
Isn't that what PayPal did too, in a way?
yeah, well, and Steve Jobs created a void and filled it. You know, nobody thought of the iPhone. Well, we can talk about that separately, but he created the void. Oh, I don't have an iPhone, and he filled it, and he did that with the Apple II and all of his other products. Nicholas, one more question about pandemics and epidemics, health level. What, from your knowledge of networks and your medical network stuff, how would you proactively prevent pandemics from happening, real life biological pandemics?
So we have one paper we just published, and I did a TED Talk, my second TED Talk on this topic, which is using networks as sensors, where you can get over the horizon warning that an epidemic is striking, and then intervene. So I don't have a specific, like I don't, obviously an impractical example would be to cease all communications between any human beings, you know, like no one talks to anyone else and interacts with anyone else, then you won't get any epidemic spread. But obviously that's ridiculous. So one idea that we have is a way in which you can exploit surveillance of populations that are network informed, specifically by tracking the infectious status of central nodes in a network, like I said, you know, if you're in the central node, you're going to be more likely to get it. Well, if we can track the central nodes, you can get advance warning that an epidemic is going to strike. And incidentally, this works with germs and with ideas and with product adoption. It works with anything that spreads between people. So if you want to forecast, so this is not like right now, the CDC, when it wants to know what's happening with an epidemic, sits in Atlanta and waits for reports from the field. So patients go to see doctors, blood tests are done, data is collected. 3 or 4 weeks from now, the CDC might know where the epidemic is today. And Google Flu Trends a few years ago comes out and says, well, we can look at people's searching behavior today and we'll know where the epidemic is today. What I'm telling you is that if you can identify central people in networks and monitor them passively or actively, you will be able to know not where the epidemic was or is, but will be. You'll be able to forecast the epidemic. And we showed that this worked in an outbreak of H1N1 flu 2 years ago by mapping a network and exploiting something known as the friendship paradox and identifying central nodes. And we were able to see that the flu epidemic was coming 6 weeks before it came. And that's more than enough time to intervene in the population and arrest the epidemic. So,
Assuming you have
something that can do it, yeah, exactly, a vaccine or some other strategy, a quarantine strategy or something, that's right. But this thing also works with...
Or the nodes that you have identified as being the key nodes actually relate to the type of epidemic that you're trying
That's
to get.
also true.
It could be the
That's also true. That's exactly right. So, you know,
Spread
but there are ways in which you can do that actually. And the same kind of thing can happen with, for instance, product adoption. So if you want to see like what is going to be the demand for a product in some future point in time, if there's any evidence for interpersonal influence of this product, if you believe that my adopting the product affects your likelihood of adopting the product, and it's not, for example, whether you buy new tires for your car isn't affected by whether I buy new tires for my car. So there's no interpersonal influence in tire purchasing. But if I buy a new iPad, it might affect whether you buy an iPad. There is, let's say, interpersonal influence with this type of product. So for products which evince interpersonal influence, the same strategy that I described for germs can be used to forecast product demand, because you can get ahead of the curve and you can see what are the things that are going to be hot, you know, in the future, by the same kind of network ideas that we discussed. So we have a paper on this. So I think that one idea in response to your question would be there are ways in which to take advantage of knowledge of network structure and big data that's available that gives us information about who's central without having to communicate with them, and can tell us about who is activated, like who has the trait of interest to forecast epidemics in a completely new way.
And if you had all that information, could you isolate, you think, those nodes, and would that help? Like if you knew that, you know, there's a million people that are very connected and are susceptible to that thing, and you isolated just them?
Yes, you could in principle, but I mean, I think, you know, we get into kind of a more science fiction type of situation there where we would have teams of people that would go out and, you know...
You're going to become ill next week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, what was that movie?
Minority Report.
Yeah, Minority Report, exactly.
Round up the ringleaders.
Yeah, exactly. Round up the ringleaders. Exactly.
lose your asset, because the next time you don't have them.
Yeah, exactly. That's also true. That's right.
So who is modeling really well, we started talking about this last time we met, who's modeling really well those external factors onto the network? So your example of, you know, relationship between women with people that they barely know is very different in Boston than in Saudi Arabia. Obviously that force for that particular network is much more than what has to do with food. Who's modeling really well the forces that are being applied to the networks, as opposed to the structure of the network, who's in the network, and what is it that is spreading?
I don't know. That's a very good question. Who's doing it? It's also a good intellectual question. You know, I mean, again, part of the problem is that for me, the things that I'm focused on are a little different than that idea. You know, I'm just interested in a pancreas is a pancreas. It doesn't matter whether it's in Saudi Arabia or here. And a network is a network. So at some level, I'm abstracting away from the cultural specificity.
Yeah, or the body.
Yeah.
Whereas the pancreas, you know, half of what it does is because of the rest of the body.
Right. So you're asking a question of like, what are the exogenous forces that lead to networks? Yeah, to shape. That's right.
Because you might, even with the same structure, even with the same people, even with, you know...
Well, no, because the exogenous force would have to work via the structure, by your argument. Right, you'd have to have something outside the system which distorts or reshapes the network in a way that is, for instance, you can imagine managers doing this, like how do we, or software doing this, like how do we create a software platform that facilitates certain kinds of connections in a firm that increases the firm's productivity, for example. That would be something outside the network that can reshape the network. So,
What about belonging to multiple networks? I belong to a photography network, a neighborhood network, social network, my family network, many different networks. How can you isolate behavior to just one of the networks being the causal agent?
well, I think that's exactly right. We all belong to multiple, we have different kinds of ties with other people, and as someone was just saying, as Rodrigo was just saying a moment ago, the germs are going to spread, the example I always give is the germs are going to spread, the syphilis is going to spread through a different set of ties than the money is going to spread, one hopes.
Yeah.
If they're spreading across the same ties, then we have
for that.
Yeah, there's a word for that, exactly. There's a word for that. So, so if you want to see like which are the networks that are relevant to the spread of syphilis, you're going to say who's having sex with who. If you want to see how does money flow through the system, who's transacting business with who. And so, but of course, people can have so-called multiplex interactions where they are co-workers with a person and friends with a person and siblings with a person and share ideas with a person and et cetera, have multiple different kinds of interactions. So, so there are techniques and ways of understanding how you can take slices of bread through the network. Like this is the friendship slice, and this is the sexual partner slice, and this is the business associate slice, and this is the the neighbor slice. And you can either stack those all together and sort of see like this person is multiply connected, or you can take them apart and look at each slice separately. And it will relate to what it is that is spreading, through the system.
If you think about any network has sort of potential transactions between the different nodes on the network. Sometimes it's conversation, information flow. Sometimes it's physical passing of germs, that sort of thing. Do you define that type of sort of typical transactions as part of the network structure, or do you find that actually each network is characterized by one type of those transactions? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I think I do. I think your question has to do with there's a deep relationship between how we define a tie and what it is that we're concerned about that might be moving across the tie.
Yeah.
So, and you can either couple those things or decouple them. So I might ask you who, for example, I might say to you, if I want to discern your important social relationships, the standard name generators are who do you spend free time with and who do you discuss important matters with. So those are the usual questions that are asked, and the average American identifies 4.5 such people. This would include your spouse and your best friend and a couple of other people, and it varies from like 0 to 8 is the upper end of the distribution. Who do you spend free time with, and who do you discuss important matters with? But then, given that, there are different kinds of things that could spread across those ties. Your best friend lives in California. You're not going to get the flu from him because you never see him.
Ideas.
Yeah, I may get ideas or whatever else. And so, these are all very hard questions. I don't have the answers to these questions. I should just say. For science that I'm blocking the name right now, which is the minimum number of nodes you have to hit so that you're within 1 degree of all the nodes in the system. And actually countries vary on this, and firms vary on this, and then you can also vary, and it saturates very quickly. So for example, if you can reach, if you pick the most popular person in the United States, you might be able to affect 1,000 people. And if you pick, the 2 most popular people, you might affect some other number. And then it eventually plateaus so that you can reach some number of people that if you contact all of them, the whole population will be within 1 degree of them. So there's a math there that can be used to answer that question, actually. The challenge is identifying those people. If you have the network, you can strategically pick those people. So for example, if you go into a village and you want to say, okay, I only have enough money to reach 10 people, who are the 10 I should reach so that if I pick these 10, everyone in the village is likely to be friends with at least one of these 10 people. You can do that once you have the network map. So that like if you're trying to get these 10 people to use malarial bed nets, then you figure that everyone in the village either will have used the malarial bed nets or will be friends with someone who's used the malarial bed nets. And you can strategically pick these 10, and a different 10 wouldn't have that property.
So you can use in-maps to do that.
Yeah. I mean, online networks are much easier to do that with data than it is with, face-to-face kind of networks.
And connecting back to your gene mapping, so-called, like if we knew the gene of everybody, could we figure out that network? Like who are the people who are the most likely to be connected to the most people?
Oh, I think maybe eventually we'll be able to do that. But I think for now, I think that's a little science fiction.